Hey, in this video, I'll be discussing why I find Christianity to be true, and for that, we're going to start at square one, which would be the debate between atheism and theism in deism. So, the first argument I would point out would be the argument from reason, which essentially goes like this. Say our reason is based on evolution and chance and just development over time. That would mean that our reason is more aimed at survival rather than determining the actual truth. For it to be something that would actually determine truth, it would need to be based on something not random and changing, meaning it would need a strong and firm, unchanging foundation. So, the most likely thing that could cause this would be some form of God or something outside of space, time, and matter, something that isn't changing and evolving over time. Because if it's changing and evolving over time, then the quote unquote truth that we're reasoning towards can also just change over time. So the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 yesterday, today, and tomorrow means that our reason we assume to be unchanging. Therefore, if we assume our reason to actually determine truth that isn't changing, it needs to rely on something that would be unchanging. So this would imply something outside of the universe, which is always in flux and changing. So the second argument I would point out would be the Kalam cosmological argument, which goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This seems pretty intuitive, but let's actually look at what traits of this cause we're reasoning towards. If this argument is true and everything has a cause and the universe has a cause, well, what is the universe? The universe is space, time, and matter, which means that to cause space, time, and matter, you need something spaceless, timeless, and immaterial outside of the things that it is creating. It wouldn't be bound by the things that it creates if it's creating those things. So this means that we have an uncaused cause that's spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And now if we look at the argument from reason again, we see that, okay, we have this reason that's based on something unchanging, which means it wouldn't be in the universe, which is bound by time, always changing, always in flux. And then we have this uncaused causer, which is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. I would say more than likely, if you look at these two things, which aren't really bound by limits and are unchanging and cause the universe, it's more likely than not that they would come from the same source. Another argument to kind of like tie these two together would be to say that every time we see reason, we see a mind that's doing the reasoning. So if we look at the Kalam cosmological argument saying that there's this uncaused cause that's spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and then we see that there's this unchanging kind of immaterial thing that is just always there and it's rational, then we can see that there would be this kind of unchanging mind too. So more than likely, we would say, okay, these two things come from the same thing or they are of the same thing. And so now we have this rational uncaused causer that's spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. So this already kind of looks like theism and deism are stronger than atheism. So at this point, we would move on to theism versus deism. So deism is the belief that God creates the universe and then doesn't really interact with it. An analogy would be the clockmaker analogy. Basically, a clockmaker makes a clock, they do all the intricate pieces, build the thing, they wind it up, and then they just leave it running and don't interact with it anymore. So I would say the first issue with this would be relations. So by nature of creating us, you already have a creator-created relation, which is like a form of interaction. So if you start with an interaction, why would the interaction cease after that? Then you have these things of like, okay, well, within us, we have morality, reason, rationality, logic, etc. And so I would say if, say, our reason, we constantly have this drive, this curiosity to find causes and effects. That's what science is all about. We see the effects, we try to determine the cause. If we see the universe as an effect and now we're trying to find the cause, why would God build us in this way to see the effects and seek the causes if he didn't want us to seek the actual cause of the universe, which would be him? So again, if God didn't want to interact with us, why would he build us in such a way that we would seek him out? You can see the same thing with us, like constantly seeking relationships between other people, deepening our bonds, etc. So then the other argument that I would make would be from miracles and divine revelation. So if God didn't want to interact with us and he didn't want anything supernatural going on, why would there be so many claims of miracles where people experience something divine that they should not rationally be able to experience? It seems clear that either a bunch of groups have been crazy throughout history or there is some form of interaction actually going on. And this is the same thing for divine revelation. Why would so many people claim divine revelation if God didn't want to interact with us? Why would this even be a thing programmed into us? Say all of these people are making up miracles and divine revelation. Why would God build us in a way, if he didn't want to interact with us, that we would look for miracles and look for divine revelation everywhere that we can find it? It just seems that if we're built in a way to look for him, to the point that we would even make up, say, miracles or divine revelation, why would he build us that way unless he wanted to interact? And I would place another little wager on this point. So I think by now we've shown that like theism is more likely than deism, but let's just say we get to the true religion by reason and we don't find any forms of interaction. Then we could say, okay, well, maybe we were wrong about theism. Let's go back and take a look. But if we get to the true religion and then we do see interaction and see miracles and divine revelation and these crazy things happening, then we can doubly dismiss deism as not true. So at this point, we would need to decide between monotheism and other forms of theism. So the first one I would start with would be polytheism, basically just saying that there's many gods. So the issue that I would point out with this would be that first causes and all-powerful beings. So the issue would be that, okay, we've talked about the argument from reason, the Kalam cosmological argument, how there's this thing outside of space, time, matter, etc. This means that it's not limited. So if this thing isn't limited and creation is a form of limitation, but now we're saying, okay, well, polytheism, we can have multiple gods who say they're equal in power. Okay, well, how can you have multiple uncaused causes? How can you have multiple first causes? How can you have multiple all-powerful beings? This would just contradict. If you have something infinitely powerful and you have another thing infinitely powerful, they both cannot be infinitely powerful. Otherwise, you have some sort of limitation between the two of them. So the fact that there can't be multiple all-powerful things kind of contradicts with what we've already reasoned through the argument from reason in the Kalam cosmological argument. So the next thing we would discuss would be Henotheism, which is essentially the belief that there's like this uncaused cause at the top of the hierarchy, and then there's a bunch of other gods underneath it. So the issue with Henotheism would be that they don't really have personal uncaused causes. So if you look at like their major religions, you'll see that, okay, well, they have this thing that's an uncaused cause, but as we've reasoned before about this thing being rational and having a divine mind, being the source of reason, then you would say, okay, well, why is their God this uncaused cause? Why is it not personal? If this thing was to cause everything else, and we have personality and persons within creation, why would this thing not at least have that? We would say that, okay, we get our reason from this unchanging, firm, rational source. You could make arguments that we get our morality from this unchanging, rational source. If you have a rational thing that has morals and it's deciding to create things, then why would it not be a personal thing? So according to like our previous logic, henotheism just seems less likely at this point. So this brings us to our next section of theistic religions, which would be pantheism and panentheism. So the issue here would be, again, kind of like, say you take pantheism, the issue would be like the personality or subjecthood of the actual God. So say God is the universe, which would be pantheism, then it's not really deciding to do things or personally interact, whatever. It's not personal in the same way as what we've already come to the conclusion of. So now let's tackle panentheism. The issue here, which would also be an issue with pantheism, would be the issues with divine simplicity. Basically saying, okay, if God is the universe or the universe is part of God, then that means that God inherently has parts. So you'd say, okay, well, why is this an issue? If you have an uncaused cause, meaning the first cause of things, it can't be composed of parts. If it has parts to itself, that means that there were things prior to God that caused God, making that God not the first cause. So again, you can't have pieces composing something, otherwise it was caused by something else. So for these reasons, I'd say we could pretty easily dismiss pantheism and panentheism, which would basically leave us to monotheistic debates. So for this, we'll be looking at the three major monotheistic religions, which would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we're going to have a couple questions here. The first one being, is Jesus the Messiah? If Jesus is the Messiah, then that means that we have to move on to Christianity and Islam, because they both claim that Jesus is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. If Jesus is not the Messiah, then that means the Messiah never came and we should still be expecting him, so Judaism would be true. The second question would be, did Jesus die and resurrect from the dead? Now, if Jesus did die and resurrect from the dead, then that means Christianity would be true. And if he didn't die and resurrect from the dead, then that means Islam would be true because we have conflicting claims here about his death and resurrection. So the first question, is Jesus the Messiah? For this, I would point to probability. So basically, the claim is that Jesus fulfilled a ton of prophecies in the Old Testament. So let's review the odds of this happening. If Jesus were to fulfill 8 prophecies from the Old Testament, the odds would be 1 in 10 to the 17th power, which is a little like abstract, weird. What the heck is that? So if you know what a silver dollar is, imagine looking at the state of Texas, which is huge, by the way, and you fill the entire state up 2 feet deep with silver dollars, and one is randomly marked. And now you're blindfolded and expected to go through all of the coins and randomly just select one and get it correct. That would be the odds of Jesus fulfilling 8 prophecies. Now, if Jesus fulfilled 48 prophecies, this would be 1 in 10 to the 157th power, which is, again, is abstract, so bear with me. An analogy for this would be winning the lottery 22 times in a row. So I would say if either of these things happen, somebody accurately picking the coin out while blindfolded in Texas or winning the lottery 22 times in a row, I would think they somehow rigged the game and there's no way this is pure chance. There had to be something more to the situation. It's just impossible for this to happen. And so this is for 8 and 48 prophecies. But the crazy part is that Jesus fulfills over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament. So this kind of points to the fact that if we go by pure probability, it's practically impossible for Jesus to not be the Messiah and just accidentally have fulfilled all of these prophecies. It just doesn't really make sense. So if we go with probability, it's overwhelmingly likely that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. So now we would move on to the next question for the dispute between Christianity and Islam. Did Jesus die and resurrect from the dead? For this, I'd mainly use the argument from the resurrection, which involves looking at what happened to the disciples of Jesus. Several of the disciples were killed for their faith in Christ resurrecting from the dead. Before being killed, they lived a life of poverty and persecution. If Jesus resurrecting was a lie that they made up themselves for no gain, why would you suffer and die for it? The fact that the disciples would be willing to suffer and die for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead makes it seem extremely likely that the disciples actually believed this occurred. You can claim that maybe they believed it, but had a mass hallucination or something, but I would contest that point and we can dig deeper in future videos. So aside from the resurrection, I'd say there's several things that can help us discern the truth between Christianity and Islam, such as the Shroud of Turin, formation of the Quran, strength and accuracy of the Bible, and claims of Jesus being divine in the Bible. But as I don't want the video to go on too long today, I'll stop for now and dig into these arguments in future videos. But hopefully this has been a good kind of intro in showing a rational path from the debate between atheism and theism and deism all the way to Christianity. So thanks for watching.